No one expected the Chief Justice of the United States to react this way. The chamber was cloaked in a silence so heavy it felt alive, pressing against every shoulder and every heartbeat. The wood-panelled walls, polished to a dark gleam, seemed to absorb the anticipation rather than echo it. A row of cameras stood frozen at the back, like hunters waiting for movement, while the reporters at the press table gripped their pens, as if the ink itself might reveal history before their eyes. Every eye in that courtroom was fixed on a single figure, Jasmine Crockett. She sat poised at the counsel's table, her notes untouched. She didn't shuffle papers. She didn't fidget. Instead, she waited, eyes forward, shoulders squared, as though the stillness itself was her armor. Across from her, the opposing attorneys leaned back in their chairs, trading knowing glances and faint smirks that reeked of arrogance. To them, this was routine, another ambitious voice to be drowned beneath the tide of precedent and pedigree. But Jasmine was not routine. She was interruption. She was challenge. She was the possibility of something no one in that chamber had prepared for. The Chief Justice adjusted his glasses, his face impassive, the very image of detached authority. He had seen countless arguments, endured endless speeches. Few ever moved him, and fewer still earned even the slightest break in his marble expression. He gave no clue, no nod, no frown, not even a raised brow, that this day would be any different. And yet, beneath the quiet, the air trembled with a current. It was the hush before a storm, the inhale before a revelation. Jasmine drew in a slow breath, her eyes flickering not to her opponents but to the gallery filled with ordinary citizens who had braved the long lines and security checks to witness this day. Some clutched their bags close, others clasped hands in prayer. It was not lost on her that she carried more than her own voice. She carried theirs too. When she finally rose, the scrape of her chair against the floor sounded like a crack of thunder. Reporters snapped to attention, pens poised mid-air. The opposition's smirks faltered just enough to betray the first whisper of doubt. And then she spoke, but the words that left Crockett's lips would change everything in that room. The case before the court was more than a legal dispute. It was a question about the very shape of the country's future. On paper, it dealt with constitutional interpretation, technical clauses that most Americans would never read. But beneath the ink and the citations lay a test of identity. Who is seen, who is silenced, and who is allowed to claim the full promise of citizenship? It was the kind of case that would ripple far beyond the courtroom, touching families, schools, workplaces, and kitchen tables across America. To the establishment, this was nothing new. They had been here countless times before, armed with centuries of legal precedent and the confidence that comes from generations of unchallenged dominance. Their lead counsel was a man whose name had become synonymous with power in the legal world, white-haired, sharp-suited, and famous for dismantling opponents with a single raised eyebrow. Behind him sat a cadre of clerks and associates, each one polished in Ivy League certainty. They exuded the smug calm of people who believed the outcome was already written in their favor. And then there was Jasmine Crockett. She did not come from the corridors of generational privilege, nor did she carry the insulation of old money or insider networks. She carried something they didn't, the lived truth of communities too often brushed aside. Her accent, her cadence, her very presence in that chamber was a defiance of the unwritten rules about who belongs in rooms like this. To her opponents, that was precisely why they underestimated her. To the people watching, that was why she mattered. This wasn't just another day in court. It was a mirror held up to America's promises and betrayals. The stakes were high not simply because of the law, but because of the lives tethered to it. In the gallery, you could see it in the eyes of those watching. Immigrant families who whispered translations to their children, activists clutching, notebooks full of slogans, elders who had seen too many marches and still wondered if justice could ever be permanent. Their faces told the truth. This was no academic exercise. It was survival, dignity, belonging. The opposition's strategy was simple. Bury the moral weight of the issue under mountains of jargon. They hoped to confuse, to complicate, to drown out clarity with a sea of legalisms. And for a while, it seemed to work. Their opening arguments flowed with rehearsed confidence, each word polished to sound inevitable. They leaned into the formality of the chamber, as if the very grandeur of the court's traditions would tilt the scales their way. But as Jasmine listened, something deeper was unfolding. This was not just a fight over statutes. It was a battle over narrative, over who gets to define the story of America. And in that battle, pedigree could never match authenticity. The air was thick with that tension. You could feel it in the way people shifted in their seats, in the furtive glances reporters exchanged as though they could sense a story brewing. The moment felt like history waiting to be written, and every second ticked louder than the last. Still, all eyes kept drifting toward the bench, toward the Chief Justice. His expression remained unreadable, his posture unchanged. The nation wondered what he thought, what he felt, and whether his silence concealed approval, disapproval, or something else entirely. And yet, no one could predict how Roberts himself would respond. They carried themselves like untouchable gatekeepers. From the moment they entered the chamber, their presence was less about the law and more about the performance of dominance. Crisp suits tailored to perfection, voices trained in debate clubs and lecture halls where dissent was rarely tolerated. They projected an air of inevitability. To them, this wasn't a contest of ideas. It was a coronation, a reaffirmation of their unshakable hold on power. For decades, the political and legal class they represented had thrived on that same posture. They had written the rules, interpreted them to their advantage, and enforced them selectively, always ensuring the ladder of opportunity tilted steeply in their favor. They were not just attorneys in a courtroom. They were heirs of a system built to reinforce itself, gatekeepers of a fortress designed to keep most people out. And in their minds, Jasmine Crockett was exactly the kind of person the fortress was built to repel. Too direct, too rooted in real communities, too unwilling to perform deference to the traditions that had elevated them. From the moment her name appeared on the docket, they dismissed her as an ambitious upstart, someone better suited for local speeches than the highest court in the land. Their arrogance was more than attitude. It was strategy. They mocked her behind closed doors, leaking quotes to friendly journalists who described her as unpolished or too emotional. They spun narratives that framed her as a grandstander rather than a serious legal mind. On television panels, commentators with pedigreed last names smirked and suggested she was in over her head, that her place at counsel's table was more symbolic than substantive. Every sneer carried the same message: you don't belong here. Hypocrisy laced their every move. These were the same voices who proclaimed themselves defenders of the Constitution, yet bent its meaning whenever it suited their donors. They spoke of tradition, yet trampled precedent when it benefited their politics. They exalted the majesty of the court, while reducing it to a stage for their own ambition. In their mouths, law and order was less a principle than a weapon, wielded selectively against those least able to fight back. Still, the veneer of elitism was powerful. They wrapped themselves in the language of civility, cloaking condescension in Latin phrases and technical jargon. They smiled for cameras, projecting reasonableness, while quietly sneering at the idea that someone like Jasmine Crockett could match them blow for blow. Their allies in Congress echoed the same disdain, whispering about her background, her cadence, her audacity to stand as an equal. It wasn't just doubt. It was dismissal, the kind reserved for people they deemed beneath the marble floors of power. Inside the courtroom, that dismissiveness was palpable. They leaned back in their chairs. Interrupting with casual objections meant less to challenge and more to rattle. When she spoke, they whispered to one another with feigned boredom, signaling to the gallery that nothing she said could possibly shift the outcome. Every gesture was a performance of superiority. They were there to win, yes, but more importantly, they were there to remind her and everyone watching of their rightful place at the top. But arrogance is a dangerous crutch. It blinds the powerful to their own fragility. In their overconfidence, they failed to see the shifting ground beneath their feet. They did not notice how the public was growing weary of polished hypocrisy, how people outside the courtroom longed for authenticity more than theatrics. They underestimated the hunger for truth spoken plainly, for dignity defended without apology. In their certainty, they forgot what history teaches again and again. Power is never permanent. It bends, it cracks, it crumbles in the face of relentless truth. And as Jasmine Crockett prepared to deliver her case, their smirks and scoffs would soon meet a force they had not anticipated. She was not there to bow before their elitism. She was there to expose it. But arrogance always forgets one thing: the power of truth. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in the gleaming halls of power, nor under the watchful eye of elite mentors who had groomed generations for the bench. It began in neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce, where a family's survival hinged on resilience, and where the weight of systemic neglect was as common as the morning news. Her journey was not paved in marble. It was carved from struggle. She grew up watching neighbors work 2, sometimes 3 jobs, and still come home exhausted, worried about rent and groceries. She saw classrooms that overflowed with students but lacked basic supplies. She heard the stories whispered by elders who had marched, protested, and endured humiliation in pursuit of rights that still felt fragile. And in the midst of those struggles, she learned something profound. Dignity was not given by institutions. It was carried by people. Jasmine was not supposed to rise in their world. She was told, directly and indirectly, that her place was limited, that the legal system was designed for others to navigate while people like her stood outside its gates. But each barrier became fuel. Each dismissal steeled her determination. She studied late into the night, worked through exhaustion, and endured the quiet humiliations of being underestimated again and again. Law school was not a red-carpeted welcome. It was a battlefield, surrounded by classmates who spoke casually about family legacies and prestigious clerkships. Jasmine carried something else: the knowledge that her community's survival depended on her success. While others breezed through on the comfort of connections, she poured every ounce of herself into mastering the law, not for prestige, but for purpose. And while some professors overlooked her, others underestimated her, she sharpened her intellect like a blade. Her first cases were not glamorous. She didn't start in marble courthouses, but in cramped offices, defending clients who could barely afford representation. She stood by tenants facing eviction, mothers fighting for custody, workers silenced by employers who assumed no one would defend them. It was grueling, thankless work, yet it was in those forgotten corners of the legal system that Jasmine forged her fire. Each victory, however small, carried weight. Each loss reminded her of the stakes. Every client she defended became another thread in the fabric of her resolve. Her authenticity set her apart. While the legal elite often spoke in riddles of precedent and procedure, Jasmine spoke in clarity, rooted in lived experience. She understood the gap between lofty ideals and harsh reality, and she refused to let anyone forget it. Her voice carried both the precision of law and the resonance of truth, accessible, unflinching, impossible to ignore. This authenticity was her strength, and it terrified her opponents. For every moment they mocked her as unpolished, people outside the courtroom recognized themselves in her. They saw a woman who didn't pretend to belong to a gilded club, but demanded space because she had earned it. She wasn't play-acting power, she was redefining it. Her service stretched beyond courtrooms. She spoke at community centers, rallied with activists, mentored young people who saw in her a reflection of possibility. For every barrier she had faced, she tried to open a door for someone else. This was not ambition for its own sake. It was service, rooted in the belief that justice was not an abstract principle, but a lived necessity. And yet, this devotion came at a cost. She endured the sneers of those who dismissed her as too bold, too direct, too unwilling to conform. She faced political attacks that questioned her legitimacy, personal sacrifices that tested her endurance. But each attempt to break her only revealed a deeper resilience. What her critics saw as stubbornness was, in truth, a refusal to betray the people she represented. That resilience was what carried her to the courtroom where she now stood, facing opponents who had spent their lives believing they were untouchable. They saw her as an outsider, unworthy of their stage. But what they could not see, what they refused to see, was that Jasmine had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Every struggle, every doubt, every dismissal had been the training ground for this very confrontation. Her identity was not a weakness, it was her weapon. Where her opponents relied on elitism, she relied on authenticity. Where they wielded arrogance, she carried the moral authority of lived truth. Where they trusted in pedigree, she trusted in perseverance. And when the moment came, she would not merely argue the law, she would embody it. The gallery that day might not have known the full depth of her story, but they could feel it in the way she stood, in the calm of her voice, in the fire behind her eyes. They sensed a lifetime of preparation. She was not simply another lawyer making a case. She was a living testament to what resilience could achieve when dignity refused to bow. Her opponents thought they were facing a rookie. What they were really facing was the culmination of battles they could never imagine. Little did they know, those very struggles forged the argument about to stun a Chief Justice. The first clash came swiftly, almost scripted. Jasmine opened her mouth to lay out the foundation of her case, and before the first sentence could stretch its wings, one of the senior opposing attorneys leaned forward with a sharp objection. His voice cut through the chamber like a serrated blade, full of authority, dripping with condescension. He wasn't truly contesting substance, he was signaling to the gallery, to the cameras, to his colleagues that he could swat her words aside before they even landed. The Chief Justice listened without expression, allowing the process to play out. To the untrained eye, it looked like a setback. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She waited, patient, her hands steady on the podium. When the objection was dismissed, she simply picked up where she had left off, unshaken, her cadence unchanged. The interruptions multiplied. A smirk here, a scoff there, muttered asides designed to rattle her focus. Another attorney leaned back in his chair, arms folded, smiling faintly as if watching a child perform for adults. Each gesture was crafted to communicate the same message. You are out of your depth. The confidence of the opposition grew with every passing minute, their arrogance thickening like smoke in the room. At one point, one of them deliberately cut across her mid-sentence, correcting her pronunciation of a Latin term. The gallery chuckled faintly. To them, it looked like a stumble, but Jasmine's eyes didn't flicker. She repeated the phrase, this time slower, louder, emphasizing not the Latin, but the plain English meaning. The laughter died in the air. She was reminding everyone in that chamber that clarity, not pretension, was the true language of justice. Still, the villains pressed harder. They threw case law at her like daggers, citing obscure precedents with the smug assurance that she wouldn't be able to parry back. But each time, Jasmine refused the bait. She didn't chase every citation. She didn't stumble into their web of technicalities. Instead, she listened, absorbed, and then redirected, pulling the focus back to the human impact, the dignity at stake, the living consequences that law books too often ignored. Her composure became its own counterattack. Where they expected fluster, she offered calm. Where they sought to provoke, she delivered patience. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tide began to shift. The gallery leaned forward, sensing something the opposition could not, that each interruption only made her steadiness more compelling. But the opposition was blind to it. Their confidence reached a fever pitch. They whispered to one another with grins, satisfied they had boxed her into a corner. One attorney even allowed himself a chuckle mid-rebuttal, shaking his head as though it were all too easy. To them, victory was already secured, and Jasmine let them believe it. She let the dismissals pile up, let the smirks linger, let the arrogance bloom unchecked, because she knew something they did not. Pressure was not breaking her, it was gathering her. Every interruption, every scoff, every attempt to diminish her was not a wound, it was fuel. The silence after their final interruption stretched long, heavy, and expectant. All eyes returned to her. The gallery sensed it. The reporters' pens hovered. Even the justices seemed to shift ever so slightly in their seats. Jasmine looked down once at her notes, then closed the folder. She didn't need it anymore. And then, when it mattered most, she struck. For a heartbeat, the chamber seemed to hold its breath. The smirks of the opposition still lingered. Their chuckles barely faded into silence. Jasmine stood steady, shoulders squared, her folder closed, as though the written word had served its purpose, and the rest must come from her alone. When she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, not hurried, but measured. Each syllable weighted like a stone cast into still water. Your Honours, this is not merely about interpretation. It is about recognition. It is about whether the promise of America applies to all of us, or only to those who have always held the keys to its gates. The first line landed like a quiet thunderclap. No theatrics, no anger, just clarity. Reporters. Pens began moving in unison. A few heads in the gallery lifted higher, eyes widening. Even those who had come in doubtful now felt the undercurrent of something shifting. She paused, letting the silence stretch before continuing. The opposition has filled this chamber with precedents and Latin phrases, with the weight of tradition. But traditions, when unjust, are not shields, they are shackles. And shackles, no matter how polished, remain chains. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The opposition shifted uncomfortably, their folded arms uncrossing ever so slightly. Jasmine pressed forward, her cadence sharpening, her rhythm quickening. They ask you to look backward, to honor decisions that excluded, restricted, and denied. They ask you to cloak discrimination in the language of order. But justice is not backward-looking. Justice demands vision. Justice demands courage. Justice demands we expand the circle, not tighten it. Her words pierce the chamber with surgical precision. Each sentence was crafted not as argument alone, but as revelation. She was not simply reciting cases, she was painting a moral horizon. The courtroom leaned toward her as though drawn by gravity. Then came the moment that sliced through the opposition's confidence. One of them attempted to interrupt, raising a hand, his voice straining to cut her off. But Jasmine did not falter. She stopped speaking, turned her gaze directly on him, and waited. The silence was devastating. It forced him to trail off mid-sentence, his protest shriveling under the weight of her calm stare. When he sat back down, visibly rattled, Jasmine resumed as though nothing had happened. Your Honours, I grew up in communities where the law was too often a barrier rather than a bridge. I saw families lose homes not because they were irresponsible, but because the system was designed to value profit over people. I saw workers silenced not because they lacked truth, but because they lacked lawyers. And I stand here today not because I am the exception, but because I am their voice, their fight, their hope. The gallery was no longer silent. You could hear soft exhales, whispered affirmations, the shifting of weight as people leaned forward to catch every word. Even the reporters, trained to keep composure, were scribbling furiously, glancing up with eyes that betrayed awe. Her pauses became weapons. After every few sentences, she let the silence linger, forcing the weight of her words to settle like dust over polished wood. Each pause was a demand that the justices, the opposition, and the country itself reckon with the truth she had spoken. And so, when the opposition insists that precedent binds your hands, I ask you, what is precedent if not the record of our own courage or our own cowardice? Precedent is not a cage, it is a compass, and today it points forward. At this, Chief Justice Roberts shifted. For the first time, the mask of detachment cracked. He leaned forward ever so slightly, his hands clasped on the bench, eyes fixed, not with polite attention, but with genuine interest. It was subtle, but the chamber felt it. The reporters noticed. The gallery noticed. Even her opponents noticed, and their smirks faltered. Jasmine did not glance at him. She did not need to. Her argument was not designed for one man, but for the soul of the room, the soul of the nation. They tell you dignity is granted by institutions, but dignity cannot be granted, it can only be recognized. And recognition is overdue. It is overdue for the families who built this country but were denied its fruits. It is overdue for the workers who carried its weight but were silenced in its courts. It is overdue for every citizen who still wonders if the Constitution they are told to revere was truly written with them in mind. The chamber was electric now. Even the marble columns seemed to vibrate under the weight of her words. Opponents shuffled papers nervously, eyes darting toward the bench for reassurance they could no longer find. Then came her crescendo. Her voice, still calm, rose in conviction. This court is not asked today to invent justice. It is asked to remember it, to restore it, to declare, not in whispers, but in unmistakable clarity, that the promise of America is indivisible. That no gatekeeper, no matter how polished his suit or how lofty his words, may deny entry to those who have already built the very foundation he stands upon. A hush fell again. She let the silence breathe, let it expand until every heart beat in. The room was thundering in unison. Then she delivered her final blow. And if the question before you is whether the Constitution protects all of us, then I submit to you that the only answer worthy of this court, the only answer worthy of America, is yes. The words hung in the air like a bell's last toll, reverberating through every ear, every conscience. The opposition's faces were pale now, their arrogance drained into disbelief. They had expected a stumble, a collapse under pressure. What they received was a masterclass, a dismantling of their posture, and a reconstruction of the moral landscape itself. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, in a gesture so rare it seemed almost mythic, Chief Justice John Roberts leaned closer, removed his glasses, and spoke. His voice, usually clipped and restrained, carried a softness that stunned the chamber. "Councillor Crockett," he said slowly, "that may be the clearest articulation of constitutional responsibility I have heard in this court in many years." The gallery erupted in gasps, reporters nearly leaping from their seats. The opposition froze, their disbelief etched into every twitch of their faces. Even the justices on either side turned their heads, registering what had just occurred. The courtroom gasped, not because she won the point, but because the Chief Justice himself acknowledged it. The courtroom may have returned to order, but outside its walls, the tremors became an earthquake. Within minutes of Roberts's words, the moment was clipped, uploaded, and unleashed into the digital bloodstream of America. A hashtag appeared almost instantly. Crockett moment. It was simple, powerful, and contagious. By the end of the day, it was trending not only nationwide, but across multiple continents, carried by communities who saw in her triumph a reflection of their own battles. Clips of Roberts praising her circulated at lightning speed, set to dramatic music, spliced into TikToks dissected on Twitter threads. One video juxtaposed Roberts' words with a slow zoom on Jasmine's calm face as she absorbed them, captioned simply, "Dignity speaks, power listens." Another meme showed the opposing counsel's smirk fading mid-hearing, accompanied by the phrase, "When arrogance meets reality." Humor and reverence collided, fueling a cultural storm. News outlets scrambled to adjust their coverage. What began as a routine case suddenly turned into a national spectacle. Headlines screamed, "Chief Justice surprised by Crockett's argument," and a courtroom silence broken by truth. Panel shows that had previously written her off now scrambled to invite analysts who could explain how she had so thoroughly dismantled the opposition. Legal scholars weighed in. Some marveled at her precision, calling it a clinic in constitutional clarity. Others admitted, sometimes begrudgingly, that her ability to weave law with moral force was rare in modern advocacy. One veteran commentator shook his head on live television and said, "I've been covering this court for 30 years, and I can't recall a moment where Roberts himself broke posture like that." Crockett didn't just argue the case, she reframed the stakes for an entire generation. Celebrities amplified the moment, adding fuel to the fire. Musicians quoted her line about shackles and chains in their lyrics. Athletes posted her closing phrase, "The only answer worthy of America is yes," as captions on Instagram. Activists turned her words into rallying cries at marches. Suddenly, a legal hearing had transformed into a cultural flashpoint. But what made it even more powerful was who picked it up. Teachers shared clips with their students, framing it as a lesson in courage. Immigrant families played it in their living rooms, some with tears in their eyes, telling their children, "She's speaking for us." Young law students, many of whom had never seen themselves represented at the highest levels of the legal system, posted in droves about how her argument made them believe again in the possibility of justice. The opposition, meanwhile, scrambled to recover. Their allies tried to downplay the moment, calling it overhyped, insisting that social media was exaggerating what was, in their words, just another day in court. But the more they dismissed it, the louder the echo became. The footage could not be spun away. It was undeniable, irreversible, and inescapable. Their arrogance had been recorded, their smirks immortalized, and their defeat framed not by legal jargon, but by moral clarity. Even within political circles, the ripple effects were staggering. Lawmakers quoted Jasmine's words on the House floor. Activists invoked her testimony as they pressed for reforms, and editorial boards debated whether this marked a new chapter for the court's public image. It wasn't just about one argument anymore. It was about what that argument represented. The collision of elitism with authenticity and the victory of truth over condescension. And beneath the headlines and hashtags, something deeper stirred. It wasn't just the spectacle that captivated people. It was the validation. For communities long told to wait their turn, to temper their voices, to settle for incremental crumbs of recognition, Jasmine's triumph felt like a door pushed open. She hadn't asked permission to belong. She had declared it. That declaration echoed across living rooms, classrooms, boardrooms, and sidewalks. It became part of the national conversation, impossible to ignore, irresistible to retell. And as the noise grew louder, the moral lesson became undeniable. The roar of applause, the trending hashtags, the endless commentary, those were powerful echoes, but Jasmine Crockett understood something deeper. This moment could not belong to her alone. Standing in the afterglow of Roberts's unexpected praise, she chose not to bask in personal victory, but to lift the meaning higher. This wasn't about the sharpness of her legal mind or the eloquence of her delivery. It was about what her presence in that courtroom symbolized, the refusal of dignity to bow before arrogance, the quiet insistence that truth can still break through the walls of elitism. She reminded the public, in her own interviews after the session, that she had carried with her the voices of countless people who never thought they would see themselves reflected in the chambers of ultimate authority. "I wasn't just speaking for myself," she said. "I was speaking for every person who has been told they don't belong, for every voice silenced, for every hand pushed aside. This was our argument." Those words reverberated more deeply than any headline, more enduringly than any meme. They drew a line in the sand. Arrogance is temporary, but truth endures. The lesson was not subtle. America had been shown, once again, that the most powerful ideas often emerge from those underestimated, dismissed, or overlooked. The so-called gatekeepers had strutted into the courtroom believing themselves untouchable. Yet it was the authenticity of a woman who had known struggle, who carried scars of lived experience, that pierced the armor of elitism and left even the Chief Justice visibly moved. Dignity had prevailed, not through volume or aggression, but through moral clarity. This is why commentators, activists, and ordinary citizens began reframing the moment, not as a mere win in a legal clash, but as a reaffirmation of what democracy requires to survive. Democracy, at its core, depends on voices like Crockett's, unafraid, unpolished by the machinery of privilege, and unwilling to let arrogance dictate who belongs in the conversation. This wasn't just about her, one editorial wrote. This was about America, and for a progressive, immigrant-friendly, identity-proud generation, that message landed like a spark in dry grass. The victory did not end when Roberts spoke. It began there. It became a story retold at dinner tables, classrooms, and marches. Parents told their children, "This is what it means to stand tall." Teachers told their students, "This is what it looks like when truth disarms power." The crescendo built not in the courtroom, but in the culture. Crockett had shown that dignity is not weakness, that calmness is not passivity, that authenticity is not a liability. She had reframed strength itself, proving it lies not in intimidation, but in endurance, not in arrogance, but in clarity. And in the end, that was the true resolution. The courtroom was just the stage. The audience was the nation. Roberts's praise, surprising and rare, was more than acknowledgement of her skill. It was the highest court in the land, however subtly, validating that her presence mattered, that voices like hers cannot be sidelined. And that's why Roberts' praise wasn't just acknowledgement, it was history whispering its approval. John. Roberts surprised by Jasmine Crockett's argument. That headline captured the moment, but it didn't capture the meaning. What truly stunned the courtroom wasn't a single phrase or a single ruling. It was the undeniable truth that dignity, when spoken with clarity, can outshine even the most entrenched arrogance. The gatekeepers came armed with titles, with smirks, with the weight of an old system on their side, but none of it could withstand the force of one voice grounded in authenticity, justice, and courage. And that is why this moment matters far beyond the walls of the Supreme Court. It is not just a story about Roberts' surprise. It is a reminder that the story of America is still being written, and that every time someone like Jasmine Crockett steps forward, the script shifts. Power does not always bend willingly, but when it does, when even the Chief Justice is compelled to acknowledge the truth, it reminds us of the possibility that lies within democracy itself. This channel exists to tell those stories, to amplify those voices, to ensure that dignity is never drowned out by arrogance, and that truth is never buried beneath noise. If you believe in that mission, if you believe in lifting courage over cynicism, clarity over confusion, then join us. Subscribe, share this story, and be part of the movement. Because moments like this do not belong to one person. They belong to all of us who dare to believe in something better. Because when courage meets clarity, even the highest court cannot remain silent.